Fenrir wasn't just a monster, he was the result. This is the story of Fenrir, not as a tale of inevitable destruction, but as a reflection of something more familiar. Do we create our own monsters? Fear does not usually wait. It does not pause long enough to understand what is actually happening or what might happen if nothing is done. It reacts, and that reaction often feels justified in the moment because it creates the sense that something is being controlled before it has the chance to become a problem. That is what makes fear powerful, but it is also what makes it dangerous. When fear becomes the reason something is acted on, it does not just respond to reality, it reshapes it. It moves too early, too forcefully, and in doing so, it begins to create the very outcome it is trying to avoid. The story of Fenrir is not just about a creature that eventually destroys the gods. It is about what happens when something is feared before it has the chance to become anything else, and how that fear changes the direction of everything that follows. Fenrir is not introduced as a monster in the way most stories begin. He is not born in the middle of destruction or chaos, and he is not immediately positioned as something that must be stopped. He is one of the children of Loki, and from the beginning, there is simply an awareness that something about him is different. That difference does not come from his actions, because he has not had the time to act yet. It comes from what is said about him. A prophecy exists, one that describes a future where Fenrir grows beyond anything the gods can control, where he becomes a central force in Ragnarok, and where he ultimately destroys Odin. That is what defines him before he has the chance to define himself. It is not his behavior, but the expectation of his behavior that shapes how he is seen. That expectation becomes the foundation for everything that follows. The gods do not look at Fenrir as something that might become dangerous over time. They look at him as something that already is, because in their minds, the future has already been decided. If the prophecy is true, then waiting is not neutral. Waiting becomes risk. And that is the point where fear begins to take control of the situation. Because once fear takes hold, it does not ask whether something has earned a response. It asks how quickly a response can be made. The gods are not reacting to Fenrir's actions. They are reacting to what they believe he will eventually become, and that belief removes any reason to give him time to become something else. So they bring him into Asgard, and on the surface, this looks like acceptance. It looks like an attempt to keep him close, to understand him, to prevent something from happening by staying connected to it. But underneath that decision, the motivation does not change. They do not trust him. They do not see him as something that can develop naturally. They see him as something that must be managed from the beginning. That difference is subtle, but it is important because it shapes every interaction that follows. Fenrir is not being raised within a system that accepts him. He is being contained within a system that is preparing for him to become a problem. As Fenrir grows, the tension around him grows with him. His strength increases, his size becomes more noticeable, and his presence begins to feel more significant. But what matters more than his physical growth is the way he is treated. The other gods do not engage with him in the same way they would with something they consider safe. There is distance, there is hesitation, there is a constant awareness that he is being watched, measured, evaluated against a future he has not yet reached. Over time, that kind of treatment becomes impossible to ignore. Even without action, even without conflict, the message is clear. He is not seen as something that belongs, he is seen as something that must be controlled. This is where the situation begins to shift from observation into action. The gods decide that waiting is no longer an option. They begin to test Fenrir, not openly as an enemy, but indirectly, through what they present as demonstrations of strength. They create chains and challenge him to break them, framing the interaction as something harmless, something almost playful. The first chain fails. Fenrir breaks free easily. The second chain is stronger, and once again, he escapes without difficulty. Each attempt is presented the same way, but the repetition begins to reveal something else. This is not curiosity. This is not admiration. It is an attempt to measure limits, to identify a point where containment becomes possible. With each attempt, the dynamic between Fenrir and the gods changes. What begins as something that could be interpreted as a test becomes something that feels more deliberate. It begins to resemble control rather than interaction. It begins to suggest that the outcome has already been decided, and that these steps are simply part of reaching it. Fenrir begins to understand that what is being presented as a game is not actually a game at all. It is preparation. It is the gradual movement towards something permanent. And once that understanding forms, the situation can no longer return to what it was before. The final binding is not like the others. It does not rely on visible strength or size. It is a ribbon, something that appears weak, something that does not match the scale of what it is meant to hold. But it is made from things that do not exist in the normal world, elements that are impossible to measure in the same way as physical material. This time, Fenrir does not accept immediately. He hesitates because the pattern has become clear. What is being offered is no longer ambiguous. It is a trap presented as trust. And that realization forces a decision that changes everything that comes after. Fenrir agrees to the binding under one condition. One of the gods must place their hand in his mouth as a sign of trust. If this is truly what they claim it is, then there should be no reason to refuse that request. Tyr steps forward, and that moment carries more weight than the binding itself. It represents the last opportunity for the situation to move in a different direction. If the gods were acting without fear, if they were responding based on what exists rather than what might exist, then trust would not need to be proven this way. But they are not. The condition is accepted, not because trust is present, but because the outcome has already been decided. When Fenrir allows himself to be bound, the ribbon holds. For the first time, he cannot break free. In that moment, the illusion is removed completely. This was never a test. It was never a demonstration. It was always meant to be permanent. And the reaction that follows is immediate, not because it is unexpected, but because it is the only response left. Fenrir bites down, taking Tyr's hand, and the relationship between him and the gods changes permanently. The fear that drove their actions has now created the reaction they were trying to avoid, and from that point forward, there is no way to return to anything that resembles trust. Fenrir is bound not for what he has done, but for what he might become. That distinction is what defines the entire story, because it removes the possibility of an alternative outcome. Once he is treated as a threat, once he is contained as something dangerous, there is no longer a path where he becomes anything else. The role he is expected to fulfill becomes the only role available to him. Over time, that expectation solidifies into inevitability, and what was once a possibility becomes something that appears unavoidable. When Ragnarok arrives, Fenrir breaks free and fulfills the prophecy exactly as it was described. He grows beyond control, he confronts Odin, and he destroys him. From the outside, this looks like confirmation that the gods were right to act as they did. It looks like the outcome they feared was always going to happen, regardless of what they chose. But the story does not resolve that simply. It leaves behind a question that cannot be ignored. Was Fenrir always going to become that? Or was that outcome shaped by the way he was treated before he had the chance to become anything else? Fear does not simply respond to what exists, it responds to what it believes might exist, and when it acts on that belief, it changes the situation itself. It removes possibilities before they can develop. It narrows outcomes before they can expand. Over time, those narrowed outcomes begin to look inevitable, not because they were always going to happen, but because every other option was removed before it had the chance to take form. That is what gives the story its weight, because it reflects something that extends beyond mythology and into the way people interact with each other in reality. People are often defined before they act. They are labeled early, judged based on what others believe they might become, and treated according to expectations that have not yet been earned. That treatment creates distance, it creates resistance, it creates a situation where the only role left is the one that was assigned from the beginning. Over time, that role becomes easier to step into than to resist, not because it is accurate, but because it is the only one that remains available. The reaction to fear becomes the force that shapes behavior, and eventually, the outcome aligns with the expectation that created it. This is why the story of Fenrir does not function as a simple warning about destruction or chaos. It functions as an examination of how fear operates, how it moves too quickly, and how it creates outcomes that feel justified after the fact. It shows how reacting to something before it has taken shape can define what that shape becomes. It shows how control, when driven by fear, does not stabilize a situation. It transforms it into something that matches the fear that created it in the first place. Fenrir is not just a figure of destruction. He is the result of a system reacting to something before it understands it. He is what happens when fear replaces observation, when control replaces patience, and when expectation replaces possibility. The destruction that follows is not just the result of his nature, but the result of the way that nature was handled from the beginning. And that is what makes the story resonate beyond its original context, because it reflects a pattern that appears whenever fear is allowed to act without restraint. The story does not end with the destruction itself, but with the recognition of what caused it. The initial reaction, the decision to bind, the removal of trust, all of it leads to the outcome that eventually unfolds. Once that chain of events begins, it becomes increasingly difficult to change its direction. Each step reinforces the next, and over time, the possibility of a different outcome disappears entirely. What remains is a path that feels predetermined, even though it was shaped by a series of choices made along the way. That is what the story ultimately leaves behind. Not a simple conclusion about whether Fenrir was right or wrong, or whether the gods were justified in their actions, but a deeper question about how fear functions and what it creates when it is allowed to act unchecked. Because once fear begins to shape decisions, it does not just respond to reality, it begins to define it. And once that happens, the outcome is no longer something that unfolds naturally. It is something that has already been set in motion, long before it becomes visible.